JT Crowley is Talking Books. On the show, you'll hear from emerging talent and seasoned veterans from around the world.
Hello, I'm JT Crowley, the host of Talking Books on Web Talk Radio. Today, I have the golden opportunity of talking to Griff Ruby from California in the United States of America about his epic book, Sede Vacante. Part 1, Dogmatic, Ecclesiology Applied to Our Times. This is a thought-provoking book, and the author has some highly interesting views around Catholicism. So let's bring him on to the show so that he can talk about his book and tell us basically why he wrote it. Griff, come and join me.
Okay. All right. Well, good day, John. I just say that because it's very different parts of day for where I'm at and where you're at.
Yes, it's 11 o'clock, gone 11 o'clock at night for me here in the United Kingdom, and I think it is probably early afternoon for Griff in California in the US. Anyway, that's by the by. Griff, before we open the book, would you care to tell the audience a little about yourself and why you wrote this book?
My own background was kind of a lengthy exploration or research for, I guess, just trying to find the truth of what makes a real civilization and real ethics and so forth. And I wasn't totally sure where to get that from or how to find that or what role the Bible, God, church, all of these would have into it. So I kind of had to explore and go through a fairly circuitous path, which I'm not going to get into here. But I did arrive to the point where at first I was getting to the point where, okay, I think I want to be a Catholic. And that seems to make sense. It seems to have all this history. But looking at a local place that said Catholic on the front door and seemed to be that, there was kind of a disconnect. But I kind of thought, well, I'll go with it for a while, work with it as it is. But as I started learning more, and then as I started meeting up with some people who could show me some of the older books, the classical catechisms, the older liturgy, and so forth, I don't think people realize just how different things were in those old days from what one finds at a place that says Catholic on the door today. The differences are substantial. So it is not just me writing this book, by the way. There's a whole community of people who have been, exploring this, pursuing this. They've kept the traditional Latin Mass alive. They've kept, just the original teachings, and really, and as I really believe, they've kept the church itself alive. And I want to be able to take what they're doing and develop it a bit further, especially to look at it theologically. And that brings me to the book itself. So, other than that, I worked as an engineer for some years, on Vandenberg Air Force Base, and now I'm retired. And I have lots of time to read and study and just do a lot of due diligence that I think more people should do. I'm not going to say, I don't think there's more to say that's relevant that I can think of.
I think you've summarized that pretty well, don't you, everybody? So, Griff, let's open this book. Now, everyone, we're not going to go immerse ourselves into this epic book, because that's not the idea of this podcast. The idea of the podcast is to give you all a sneak preview as to what you can expect from Griff Ruby's book. So Griff and I, have had several chats beforehand, and we have picked some interesting areas of the book to talk about. Now, these areas will give you a very insightful view of what this book is about. So, as I said, we're not going to go into all of it. If you want to know more about it, then you can go to his webpage, www.the/pope.com, or simply go to Amazon or wherever you can get his books and go and buy it and read it for yourself and make your own opinions. But as I said, we've selected some chapters, some sections for you. So, Griff, let's take the audience to Doctrine 2 on page 8 of the book, headed up The Infallibility of the Pope and Church. Now, having looked at this area of your book, you touch upon quite a few concepts, theses, debates. However, you want to dress these issues up. You talk about the meaning of the term infallibility, the fact of infallibility, corollary, the nature of infallibility. Now, I think it would be fair to say that a lot of people, both in and out of the Catholic Church, struggle with this concept of infallibility. You seem to go into quite an in-depth explanation with some very, very interesting viewpoints. So, would you care to tell the audience why you have penned this doctrine here?
Very well. Well, this being the second, it is the second of what I call 16 doctrinal categories. And the first being indefectibility. This one, infallibility. I'm going into this about, we've heard that expression, infallibility of the Pope. There's a lot of mistaken ideas people have as to what that even means. Does it mean he never says anything wrong? Does it mean everything that comes out of his mouth is, from divine revelation or something? And no, it does, however, mean that, first of all, when he's trying to teach and define a doctrine regarding our faith or morals to the church, and insisting that this is for the church to believe, then he is to be divinely protected from teaching something that is wrong about a doctrine, about our faith, about our morals. It doesn't mean that he will know the truth about, if you ask him a scientific question. It doesn't mean that, it doesn't mean a lot of things that people seem to think it does, that he doesn't sin, for example. No, popes can be, like, in that sense, very much like you and I, because they are, after all, human beings with simply a particular sacred gift that comes with the office. Now, a significant amount of this chapter isn't really my thoughts at all, but in fact extracts from a theological work, which, by the way, would be this book here, Dogmatic Theology, by particularly Volume 2, Christ Church, by Monsignor G. Van Noort. I have a little from the first and third volume, but most of what I have from here is in this second volume. And all of these quotes that I'm giving here are from Monsignor G. Van Noort, who's dwelling on all the different relevant concepts, what it means, what it doesn't mean, and how it extends also to such things as how he does disciplines. For a discipline in the church is not a doctrine and is not a faith. Do we fast on Fridays? What if we fasted on Tuesdays or something? Those would be disciplines. Now, disciplines can be changed, but one thing they can't do is be inconsistent with the teaching of the church, either the Pope himself or all the popes before him. Because once something is confirmed as infallible, it is a teaching that the church retains forever. And that's what I can say about this. And then, so the only controversies I got into is that if we know what the church teaches and what the parameters are for the papal office, what are we supposed to do when the church has promulgated something infallibly, and all of a sudden somebody that we think of as Pope is teaching something that's just not consistent, or imposing doctrines that are clearly injurious to that idea, destructive, and not part of it? So that's where many Catholics today are struggling. So that's what I'm focusing on in this particular section here.
Okay, well, let's go to Doctrine 3, which you put in the book, the authority of the church, which you just briefly touched upon there. For me, you talk about a broad concept here, and you broach the church's ideology from a different prospect. This is just my opinion of what I've looked at your book. I think many of your readers will find your convictions, your slant, bordering on, I don't know if I'm right in saying this, but should I say confrontational or just very opinionated? Um, or at best provoking? But you focus on the Church of Christ, the hierarchy, the hierarchy in the society. Why are you talking about the authority of the church, this Doctrine 3 category in your book? Is it so important to you that you're talking about it?
Okay. Well, you may have a point about some of the attitude. And I think ultimately, I think this book would probably have to be described as a bit of a polemic. So, I mean, I am trying to prove something here. And what I'm also doing is basing what I'm proving as solidly as possible on the standard established teachings of the church. And I use theological quotes because they'll discuss a matter in much more detail. Because you could find an isolated quote in a catechism or even a papal encyclical, and yeah, good solid sources, but it might be one sentence, and it's not exactly fleshed out all of what that means, what it doesn't mean, the domain of what it could refer to and what it can't refer to, and so forth. So authority has become an issue because that's exactly what's been getting corrupted in, basically since Vatican II. So you have this authority, it is taught what the church is, what it teaches, what it's all about. It's really established our faith in an enormous amount of detail that I think most Catholics aren't even aware of. And sad to say, I can't say I'm really doing a whole lot to bring in a whole lot of that per se. I'm actually kind of assuming the reader knows that, but we'll get more of that when I talk about who this book is for. See, the thing is, when authority seems to be getting messed up, it's easy for some Catholics to think maybe it's gone, maybe it's disappeared. But no, it can't just disappear. And I think if there's anything else that I'm trying to prove at this point, it's that it hasn't disappeared, but only that we have to determine who really is the church, who speaks for the church, and recognize that authority rather than just anybody who hangs out their shingle as well, I'm the Pope, I'm the bishop of this or that, and but are they really part of the church? There are good reasons to think they are not. But then there are those who are the church and we do obey that. We do we should be obedient to. So I think that's why authority is important to me, because I don't want people thinking it's just disappeared because there's been this massive failure. So
I told you he'd have some very interesting viewpoints, everybody. Now, Griff, let's take the audience a little deeper into the book and look at Rome, the eternal diocese, Doctrine 11 category, which is on page 107 of the book, everybody. Here I find you talking about the imperishability of the Roman See, the diocese of Rome, the real Catholic Church in your eyes, as opposed to, as you put it, the modern Vatican apparatus. Bishops in the woods, Petrine diocese relocated, and even floating the concept of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, that is, and a remnant of his flock living in exile in London or New York. I thought that bit's fascinating. Now, the Roman Church would still operate. Would it? Okay. You even ask at the end of this chapter, category, section, however you want to see it, everybody, you put to the reader 10 questions to contemplate on. My question is, what is the purpose of this chapter? Why have you positioned it here in the book? But above all, for me, where do your thinkings on the various subject matters touched upon here come from?
okay, now we will have skipped over a lot of important doctrines about the church, about the visibility of the church, and about the marks of the church. And a very important part is the survival of the church into our time. Well, there I just went through chapters 4 through 10 in one sentence. So we get to Rome, the eternal diocese. By the time you will have studied these things, one will understand that it is the traditional Catholic community alone which has the which really has the 4 marks of the church. That organization run from today's Vatican City by some guy who calls himself Francis does not possess any of the marks of the church. I will have been proving that layer upon layer, mark upon mark, all the way through on all those chapters we jumped over. So by the time you get there, we get to, the big question is, do we really have a pope today? And the answer really, well, even traditional Catholics may not always be ready to reach a conclusion. And that doesn't necessarily mean that people are wrong. It just means that there are some questions that some people may simply feel is above their pay grade. I can't blame somebody for feeling that way and just say, well, I'm not going to reach an opinion about that sort of thing. That's above my pay grade. But not everybody says that. Some people realize when you're talking about eternal life, there's nothing above our pay grade. And that really gets down to a number of Catholics when looking at the situation, looking at what it means to be Pope, and then they're looking at what they've seen coming out of Vatican City, since basically Vatican II onward, they'd have to say, these guys cannot be actual successors of the Apostle Peter. They just cannot. That being the case, does that mean it's all failed? I mean, what about, well, don't they have cardinals over there and all sorts of other functionaries? What are we to make of them? And just because the Diocese of Rome is an eternal thing does not necessarily mean that it always has to reside physically in that location. We have a historical period where for a time it was in France, in Avignon. And then after a while it moved back to Rome. And then after that, more events happened where people couldn't be sure for a while. But at any rate, I think the church is sure that it would be in Rome, if anywhere, at that time. But when it was in Avignon, it was in Avignon because they couldn't live in the Roman area at all. And that kind of situation can arise. So we have to look at the kinds of questions. Again, you mentioned London or New York, and those cities are not actually referenced in my words. They're referenced in the words of the theologians I'm quoting that suggest that he's throwing this out as an example. What if it had to relocate to London or New York or anywhere else in the world? Would that make it less the center of the church? If that's where the Pope is, then it's still the center of the church. So that's what that's saying. So we're exploring that. Again, if you think authority is broken down, then it might be easy to wonder if then the whole ability to have a pope, or for there to be a pope, to have cardinals, may have also fallen by the wayside. And I'm showing that that is not an acceptable belief, even though there's a lot of possibilities that Catholics have been exploring as to what could be. I'm listing some of those possibilities. I discussed some of them. You may have noticed, if you caught it at the beginning, he said that this was part 1. There is a part 2 in which theories about all of what has happened are discussed, and a number of those theories involve some of these different alternatives. So that's why we ask the questions. At the end of every chapter, or almost every chapter, there are questions. They are not review questions like if you've read the chapter, you should find the answer, the way a normal student textbook would be set up. Rather, you come to the end of a section, and there are questions that have been raised in there. The findings that we had before, that are first listed at the end of each chapter, these are things that we've seen, that I've demonstrated. The questions are what therefore has been raised about what is in there. This, interestingly enough, is the one section that actually raises more questions than it has answers. And they're tough questions. And some of the questions raised get addressed later in this book. And some of them, a fair amount of them here, have to get addressed in part 2. So anyway, it's all there, and it just seemed an appropriate time to talk about that. So,
I totally agree. And yes, everybody, when you do look at a lot of the categories at the end there, or the chapters, the sessions, sections, whatever you want to refer to them, there are, in most of them, towards the end, questions and findings. And I found a lot of them very, very interesting. And it really does make you think what Griff has researched and talking about in this fabulous epic book of his. So let's delve in a little bit further, everybody. Now, the church as a perfect society. Is it perfect? This is Doctrine 16, and it's on page 166 in your book. Now, this title caught my attention. It's one of your shorter sections, categories. And here I find you asking the reader to focus on two objections, which you answer in your own discernible way. Would you care to tell the audience what you're discussing here? But is the church perfect, in your view?
okay. Well, we have to look at what we mean when theologians say about the church is a perfect society. They are not claiming that it is free from faults of individuals or sometimes even the occasional imprudent discipline or other things that may come through, or policies, or even an occasional misjudgment or adjudication of some complex situation that maybe the person appointed to adjudicate this situation wasn't equal to the task, and things of that nature. When we talk about perfect, and the quotes bring this out, really, the key to everything in here really isn't even so much my words, the quotes. The quotes explain that by perfect, it means that it has within itself what it needs. So let's contrast this with something that's not a perfect society, a corporation. Corporation, has its own things and so forth, but it exists in the context of a secular government that sets up a number of laws and rules by which it has to operate, to the point that the documents that define the corporation itself are really almost more like bylaws, if you will, you see, because the corporation doesn't just exist in and of itself, independent of everything else. It depends on the surrounding society for some of the inputs and some of its decisions about what it can and cannot do. When we say the church is perfect, we mean the church does not need anything of that sort. It has all that it needs from a legal, canonical, visible standpoint within itself. So, for example, it's for the church to select the Pope. It's not for something else to come along and say, here's going to be your Pope, church. See, that would be an imperfect society if it were set up that way. And that's why that's important. Once you realize that the Vatican apparatus as it exists today is not the church, you realize that they couldn't give us a Pope even if they wanted to, which they don't. You see, it's up to Catholics. And I discuss the details of exactly who, how, and what Catholics, and we'll get to that in a later section. So, which we will discuss. So that's why the perfect society, is so important. Now, in the same doctrinal category, I do also talk about what about the imperfections and so forth, and how imperfect could things be just from a human standpoint. And there is a degree to which some of that is possible. And, again, the doctrinal writers have described that in some detail. And that's what that's about. It helps people understand what things are involved. But that is not the same thing by perfect society. Or here's another perfect society. A standalone nation could be a perfect society. Again, it's obviously very flawed, being a human origin, could be highly flawed in terms of its government or other things. But as long as it has everything within itself to operate itself and sustain itself, it would still be within that definition of a perfect society. So that's an important distinction to understand and to discuss both parts of that. And that's what I have on the perfect society.
I think that was a very, very good answer. Well done, Griff. Now, The next area of the book we're going to move, we've moved, there's a change here, everybody, because Griff has moved away from doctrine to deductions. Now, Griff, let's move on further into the book. And on page 175, here we find the title Summary of All Basic Findings. Now, I notice that you don't classify this section, this chapter, as a doctrine. It's now a deduction. Fascinating. So, firstly, have you done this to emphasize to the reader there's a shift, a new undertone to the messages you're conveying? And secondly, the 16 findings you talk about and the 6 questions you raise here, to me, give the impression you're taking the reader on a slightly different path and making them think differently. Am I right? And if so, why have you changed from doctrine to deductions? Where are you taking the reader here, Griff?
Well, when I'm going through the doctrinal categories, remember, they're all building on one, to some degree, one upon the other. A lot of them are pretty independent and standalone, but there is some degree that some of them build upon the others, and especially those between the one we last talked about and the one we're going to, or actually between the, well, basic sections, 12 through 15, we've talked about much more detailed and subtle doctrines that won't make much sense to talk about them until you're already pretty well versed in the first 10 or 11 parts of this book, but they're all solidly based in doctrine. Now, once we've got a lot of these doctrinal findings put together and a number of the questions, not all obviously, but a good many of them have been answered, the next question is to get to, so what can we get from these doctrines that have been demonstrated and proven throughout the book? What do we know? Let's put it all together. Kind of, that's why the summary is, well, that's what it's about. It's about putting all these findings together. And probably the main one of these findings is this. It goes back to the title of the book. Do we have a pope or not? And what we find by the time we get to this point is that there really are 2 separate societies at operation in this whole story. There's the actual Catholic Church that dogmatically must and therefore does exist and can only exist in that which is visibly Catholic. But at the same time, there is also this other organization that has been taken over, has been corrupted, whatever you want to call it, into something quite alien to what Catholicism is really all about. And we don't want to judge a man. Judging a pope is something we don't want to do. You don't want to say, I know you're the pope, but I say you're wrong. You see, you don't want to say anything like that, because that in itself is just a wrong position. One of the chapters, like 14 in between, will talk about that. But on the other hand, does that mean you just can't address the question at all? Obviously, we have to, but we have to take it slowly and carefully and so forth, and proceed with caution. And in particular, we have to do it in a non-accusatory manner. So by the time we get to section 17, we have demonstrated that the leader at Vatican City is not a pope by virtue of the different nature of the office he occupies. It is an office with a duty to destroy the Catholic faith, to injure it, to sow division and problems and frankly, heresies and destructive disciplines and everything else. And that, unfortunately, is the purpose of that. So when I say he's not a pope, at this point, I'm not judging the man at all. I'm saying he's not the pope in the same sense that I could say that the chairman of the Southern Baptist Convention is not the pope either. I'm not blaming the man. I'm not accusing. Probably, if I met him personally and socially, I might quite like him. But I wouldn't, think of calling him the pope, or the Mormon prophet, or the chief rabbi of Rome, or you name it.
Okay.
You see, they're not the pope because they don't, the king of England is not the pope, because these people occupy different offices, the very nature of which is incompatible with being a pope. So, with that in line, now we know the person's not a pope without having judged him as a person. From that point on, we can say, well, since he's not pope, of course he's not going to be infallible. Of course he's not going to be a living rule of faith for Catholics. And all of that starts to make more sense. So then that gets us ready to proceed on into the further deductions of the chapters to follow.
And let's go to them. So Griff, let's finally whiz to deduction section 19. The ability of the church to provide herself with a pope, page 227. What drew me to this part of the book was the 11 findings you highlight at the end of this section. In particular, what caught my eye was finding number 10, and I'm going to quote it. We're, per impossible, the Vatican organization to come to have a real Catholic in charge who seeks to restore it to the fullness of the Catholic faith, worship and valid sacraments. All of this happening would still not make him a pope, but the universal acclamation of him as pope by all the traditional bishops, should they do so, would make him pope. But realistically, if ever that happened, the heretics would quickly eliminate him and take steps to prevent the same thing from ever happening again.
Okay. So
what's the relevance of that bit there?
Relevance. Well, relevance is this. I really believe that the only way the church is going to get, the real church is going to get a real pope, is if the leaders of the church, the traditional Catholic bishops, basically organize the conclave. I know some people think, oh, it has to be cardinals. Well, there aren't any real cardinals left. So what happens? Does it just become impossible? It can never be impossible for the church to provide herself for a pope. All that happens is if the normal people whose job that is don't exist, the role just evolves to the next lower level, which would basically be, in a nutshell, the remainder of the real hierarchy of the real church. It would fall to them. If they got together and organized pope, that's the most likely way we get a pope. Could the Vatican organization repent? Well, let's start with a simpler. Could the guy running the show decide to repent one day? It's not impossible, but even if he did, a whole society has been built up around so many false things, so many false positions and doctrines and destructive disciplines. And the thing is, a really slovenly existence, I might add, that after everybody gets used to that, it's kind of hard to suddenly climb and jump back up to the high ideals of what it really would be to be the Catholic Church. It's a very high standard, morally, personally, and so forth. It's a very high standard. And they have long accustomed themselves to living at a much lower, sloppier, messier level. They kind of let the lunatics take over the asylum, and basically it's gotten to the point that if somebody wants to say, okay, it's time to put the lunatics back, away, and we'll return to power, it's like, oops, you can't. You let them have the run of the insane asylum, and now they're running it, and that's it. So I don't think that's going to happen, but I don't know the future. No one does. And, personally, I think the chances of one of those people, actually repenting and really seriously even trying to restore things is probably about on par with the odds of, say, you or me becoming the president of the United States. It's not physically impossible. It's just, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But I have to be fair and honest and say, but if such a thing happens, you say, and that's the main thrust of that, if such a thing were to happen. But let's say he's actually successful. He manages to keep himself from being assassinated. He manages to get rid of all the handlers that get in the way of him trying to do all the right things, and he could do all of that. The traditional bishops would see that attempt. They could recognize it and say, we have a real pope again in this person. And sometimes the election of popes can be by acclamation. And so that's what I'm talking about. So there we have it. I mean, as I say, I think the other is a far more likely and realistic approach, that more likely the church simply provides herself with the Pope. It certainly is consistent with the church being a perfect society. But, I don't know. We have to see what's going to happen.
Who did you write it? Who did you write this book for? And if Pope Francis had a copy of your book, what do you think he'd say? So who have you written this book for, and what do you think the Pope would say?
Well, he's not a Pope, and frankly, I think if he saw it, I don't think he'd get past the second page, because I bring up Catholic doctrines that he doesn't like. So, but I think I need to, this is a good time as any to bring up, who really is this for? I've mentioned that there are traditional Catholics. They want to go by the old standards, the old catechisms, the old mass and sacraments and everything else. And these are not some scattered individuals. This is actually a surprisingly large community of people who have, wrote and read such books as The Open Letter to Confused Catholics by Marcel Lefebvre, The Ottaviani Intervention. This particular draft is translated by Father Shikata. The Problems with the New Mass, which really shows how different, what they do as so-called Mass today, and how terribly, frightfully, fundamentally different it is from what Catholics have done from the beginning until the 1960s as the Mass. The Reform of the Roman Liturgy is another fairly well-known book to this community. The Great Facade is another. It's not one of the stronger ones, but it does have a lot of details. Iota Unum is probably one of the more important books in this area. These are big, thick tomes. They're heavy reading, and there's a lot in them. If you can handle this, you can handle my book.
Oh,
and a lot of people have written. What?
It's a big book, everybody, and it's very, very, very well written and put together.
What, Iota Unum or mine?
No, your book. It's very, very well written.
I got more than that enough. So there's people who've seen these things, who read these books, they're familiar with the issues. They understand how different things are today and what passes for Catholic from how things were throughout the first more than 1900 years of church history. And they're going, how can this be? I don't get it. My Sede Vacante book is the next thing to read. It's like you've mastered Math 3A, calculus. Now let's move on to Math 3B, which is, say the next more advanced calculus. It's just where to go next.
Okay.
If you don't understand those differences, then probably my book isn't going to be of much use to you. I'm being brutally frank here. It's not really meant for just anybody who says, what do we mean by that? Or what is this all about? If you don't understand what the church was and what people mistake for the church has become and made of itself, and how terribly, frightfully, drastically different they are from each other, then you wouldn't know what I'm even talking about, probably. So that's it. This is meant for people. You don't have to have read all the books. Usually people have just read maybe one or two or three of them, and that's enough. Not all of them are thick like Iota Unum.
Now, are you going to write another book?
Well, there is already, as I've indicated, a sequel, which is part 2, and that has to do with theories of what's going on. The first is focused on the dogmas and the doctrines. What do these tell you that the church expects us to believe as Catholics? And discussed in enough detail to really understand what the church is teaching us. Now, we move on that. We use that as a framework to look at various theories that could be posited as to how could all this even happen? I mean, there's the promises of God, and, the church is indefectible. How did indefectibility interact with what we've all seen happen, you see? And so we get into the realm of theory. So that's already volume 2. Do I have plans for further volumes? At this point, they remain almost as vague as they did back when I wrote these books. I might want to put together a collection of essays or something like that. But really, with the 2 books, it's like I've had the second and third calculus classes already here, and it's time to move on into other areas.
Griff, where can people get your book from?
Well, the simplest as it stands right now would be Amazon. Look up my name, or that's probably the easiest one. And it's also available directly from the publisher, iUniverse. I don't know where else it might be available, but one can look on Google, and sometimes people can pick up used copies somewhere too. So it's been around, and it continues to sell, and has for, since its publication in 2017.
So would you recommend people go to your webpage as well?
Well, the web page is mostly useful. It goes back to a somewhat older time when I was writing my previous book, which could be another source to read, by the way, which is called The Resurrection of the Roman Catholic Church. This is mostly the history of all these traditional Catholics. Who are they? What have they done? How did they do what they do? What questions have arisen that can sometimes even set Catholic against Catholic, even as they all are really on the same team? All those kinds of questions. And what are we to make of all that? But it's mostly history, narrative, biography, a lot of different characters in that book. And so, again, that kind of has a layman's basic understanding of what I'm trying to say in my Sede Vacante volumes. But if you really want to dig into the serious theology of it, you need the Sede Vacante books to see what it is I'm really trying to say there. So the Resurrection book, I like having it available as a book. You can, take it and read it on the plane or whatever. But, a full-length text of it, in an earlier draft, unfortunately, is online on my website. There's a lot of questions and answers. The book handles in the back, but you could also just go straight to a question and answer. There's a lot of that. There's, just different correspondence I'd received concerning it. So there's different things like that, but I haven't updated that. It occurs to me there's one specific place where you could get something most specific, tailored to the Sede Vacante books, and that would be, I believe the file is called blog, blog.txt. And that is basically, when I was on a forum some years back, they were asking me to defend what I was saying, and I did. And that's what that did. It just sort of goes like the Sede Vacante book, but it's a lot more compressed and maybe simpler and quicker to read. So that's probably the one thing that would most directly relate to my Sede Vacante volumes. It's on the site. The Mr. Ubi Petrus place on YouTube, the channel on YouTube, Mr. Ubi Petrus put together, that would have more. It's had a number of my talks. It's also just had where I introduced my books when I had them published. I haven't added too much to those things later, although if I can put this podcast on here, I'd like to do that.
Oh, you will. He will, everybody.
And that's about what there is. So I did want to.
I have to say, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed our little chat about Griff Ruby's book, Sede Vacante. I certainly enjoyed reading it and having a look at it. And I hoped that the areas that we highlighted were of interest to you. So all it leaves me to say is to Griff, thank you very much for giving me the wonderful opportunity to look at his book and to chat to him over the last few weeks. We've had, we've had some interesting times. So I'd just like to say, Griff, thank you very much for coming on the show.
Okay, well, thanks for having me.
I'm JT Crowley. Thanks for listening, wherever you're in the world. Until next time, stay safe.